Citizen slave!
So, we're once again in the wake of another tragic school shooting in America, and the video game violence debate that I thought we'd long moved past has resurfaced. In essence, many American politicians, in particular Republicans, along with the president, have rolled out the tried and tested violent media is influencing the violence carried out in mass shootings spiel. Art has always been in some way blamed for violence by the establishment. Comics in the 50s, music in the 60s, film and TV in the 70s, video nasties in the 80s, and then we arrived at video games in the 90s. Now that's obviously somewhat of a generalisation, as various art forms have been blamed for copycat violence in other decades as well, such as rap music in the 80s and 90s, but you get the idea. A year after the release of the original and highly controversial Mortal Kombat in 1993, politicians called for regulation of video games with the same notion of violent games influencing real violent acts. It was in light of these political calls for regulation that the American game industry created the ESRB in order to self-regulate without any governmental control. Over the years, some games have certainly courted controversy in regard to violence. Doom, Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto, to name but a few, have all been blamed for real-world violence. As the industry has continued to grow, mature and establish itself as one of the most popular forms of modern media, the outdated view of game violence in some way having a causal link with actual violence had seemingly subsided. After all, a plethora of studies have found no causal link to the playing of or depiction of violence in gaming as having any literal effect on players undertaking a real-life reflection of that gaming violence. That is, until 2018, when we are back to the same uninformed opinions from some politicians that were prevalent in the 90s. I've studied censorship and violence in cinema and gaming for most of my adult life. In my opinion, games and films as visual media will often become a facade for those already planning a violent act. Therefore, if an individual has decided to commit a violent act, a specific piece of visual media can often become a guise for them to use when engaging in real-life violence. A case in point was the killing of one of the novelist John Grisham's friends, William Savage, in 1995. Sarah Edmondson and Benjamin Darras dressed up as Mickey and Mallory Knox from Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers. One of the victims who survived, Patsy Byers, took Edmondson and Darras to court and, from the advice of Grisham, also involved Oliver Stone and Time Warner, as he believed Stone's film influenced and thus caused the death of his friend. However, Byers and Grisham didn't win the case, and eventually in 2001, a judge ruled there was no evidence that Stone and Time Warner had intended to incite violence. As I've already said, Edmondson and Darras were clearly mentally unstable and planning to commit an act of violence. Natural Born Killers gave them a facade or context in which to fulfill that violence rather than in any way causing it. Let's refocus specifically on games and some of the accusations games often receive from those who believe they incite or influence violence. There is the obvious interaction with something violent argument, the notion that a player becomes desensitized over time by playing violent content. Another argument is against first-person shooters, and how they teach gamers how to use guns, shooting an array of enemies as if they don't matter, thus making players less empathetic and more likely to copy and engage in the violence they've been playing. There are clear issues with those accusations. Desensitization, for instance, is prevalent to all forms of violent media. This includes news footage depicting wars, shootings and other violent acts. Game violence is the less real of those forms of media, in part due to the graphic limitations and the inherent lack of reality. In terms of first-person shooters, they simply aren't teaching gamers how to use guns. They're teaching them how to move a character in the first-person viewpoint with a reticule via a controller or keyboard and mouse. That is quite overtly not at all like using a real firearm. I'm from the UK and have very limited experience of using guns. I've only undertaken clay pigeon shooting a few times. Neither of those experiences are anything like using a gun in a game. Yes, you point and shoot, but with thumbsticks or a mouse, hardly manual training for the use of a firearm. Violent games and movies played and watched throughout the world, yet it's America that easily has the highest frequency of mass shootings in this context. The logical conclusion then is that if violent media doesn't incite violence elsewhere, it doesn't in America. We therefore come back to gun control. So why now, in 2018, after so many horrific school shootings in America, are we returning to similar excuses as before? Well, deflection, to put it simply. I'm certainly no expert in American politics, but those with connections to and probable monetary campaign support from the NRA are those politicians who are using violence in games and films to deflect the ever-increasing call for tighter gun control. I won't go into that particular subject matter any further, as it's a very divisive topic and it's an obvious use of violent media to muddy the argument and deflect from the real issue. Games have become an important tool to help those with depression, mental illness and loneliness. They can focus a burns patient and help them deal with their physical pain. They can help a cancer patient to explore another world other than the hospital and treatment rooms they're so often in. Games have helped build huge communities around the world and connect people in ways we couldn't have dreamt of without them. There is no proven causal link between violence in games and films to real-life violence. The reason for that is because there isn't one. Thank you for watching, and please talk to me about this in the comments. Do you agree with my stance on video game violence, or do you have an opposing view? If you enjoyed this video, please like the vid and sub to the channel. If you didn't like the video, hit that dislike button. That's what it's there for. Not everybody likes everything. I shall see you very soon. Take it easy. Citizen slave.